Good morning, and welcome to the Amicus Therapeutics and Penn Medicine Orphan Disease Center webinar series, Let's Get Real, Harnessing Non-Proprietary Patient Registries and Real-World Evidence to Accelerate Rare Disease Drug Development. My name is Paul Howard, and I'm Director of Public Policy at Amicus. I'd like to thank my colleagues at Amicus and the Orphan Disease Center, especially Jim Wilson, Monique Malloy, Eric Marsh, Samantha Charleston for working so hard to bring this concept to fruition today. Amicus and the Orphan Disease Center are partners in many scientific endeavors, but we also recognize that the siloing and fragmentation of patient registries makes it extraordinarily difficult to answer critical questions related to rare disease drug development. But we also recognize that drug development is a team sport and that we'd have to bring the community together to solve these persistent challenges in a thoughtful way. Of course, if this was an easy problem, someone would have solved it already. So we've structured the the webinar series to minimize Zoom fatigue, an ever-present problem in the age of COVID, and allow all of our attendees the time to absorb and reflect on each conversation and discussion before moving on to the next one. We'll also be posting a bibliography on each topic in advance of each discussion series to keep the community engaged. I'd also like to thank our sponsors for helping to promote the event, including Bio New Jersey, Life Sciences Pennsylvania, the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine Foundation, and the Alliance for Artificial Intelligence in Healthcare. Our first topic in the webinar series is Beyond the Tower of Babel, FDA leadership on data standards. But before we begin that discussion in earnest, we wanted to offer you a mission moment. The voice of a rare disease patient caregiver who can help us all align around our mission and our responsibility, developing safe and impactful treatments for rare disease patients as efficiently as possible, while being responsible stewards of the data and information contributed by patients and caregivers throughout their journey. To offer that perspective, I'm honored to introduce Dr. Tracy Dixon Salazar, a neuroscientist, geneticist, and patient advocate. Tracy's desire to get her PhD was inspired by her daughter, who developed Lennox-Gastaut syndrome at the age of 2. Her work at the University of California, San Diego led her to help identify the genetic causes of rare disorders in children, and where she also researched precision therapeutics in stem cell and animal models of pediatric disease, including a novel precision therapy that improved her child's life. Tracy now works as the Director of Research and Strategy at the Lennox-Gastaut Syndrome Foundation, where she works directly with patients to access precision therapeutics and partners with researchers, clinicians, regulators, policymakers, therapy developers, and other advocacy groups in an effort to build a sustainable precision medicine infrastructure for all patients with epilepsy. Tracy, please take it away.
Great, thank you so much. Can you guys see my slides all right? Yes.
Yes.
All right. I'm going to say yes. I'm going to start with yes, though. Thank you guys for having me. I really appreciate being here. I'm really excited about the meeting that you guys are having and the potential that we have. Just to get us started, I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about our story and our journey. I really didn't know when my daughter, who was typically developing and healthy, when she had her first seizure at the age of 2, I really had no idea how dramatically our lives had just changed. And about 6 months later, when new seizure types emerged at the age of 3 and they started coming every day, I had no idea that our life had really completely gone off the rails at this point. We believed everything that we were told. We believed that seizures didn't damage the brain. She was having these seizures. We believed that you can't die from epilepsy. You just needed to take medicine to stop the seizures. And we believed, that we were told, thankfully, we don't need to know what causes seizures in order to treat them. And none of those things were true, but we believed them anyway. When my daughter was diagnosed with the rare disease Lennox-Gastaut syndrome at the age of 5, after thousands of seizures and injuries and hospitalizations and unanswered questions, I really didn't understand what that meant. I didn't understand that the seizures had taken over her brain development, had spread, had disrupted the network to a point where the chances of her getting any sort of seizure control in her life was almost 0. I knew LGS was bad, but I didn't know how bad, and I was devastated, and I didn't know what to do. This is pretty common rare disease journey for most people. And I didn't know how this all started in my healthy child, so I didn't know how to help her. And there was nothing that we did that could stop the seizures. This is when I enrolled in college. There was just so much I didn't know, and I really wanted to help. I didn't know that I was going to spend the next 12 years in school trying to understand what could cause epilepsy. I ultimately got my PhD in cellular molecular neuroscience, did a postdoc in neurogenetics where we actually identified genetic causes of epilepsy. But that all happened on the backdrop of 16 years of horrific daily seizures that my daughter was having. She had more than 40,000 seizures. She tried and failed more than 25 different therapies. She was seizing every day. You never knew what you were going to get from day to day. And at the age of 18, she had severe intellectual disability, was still seizing, was getting emergency rescue meds a couple times every week, repeat trips to the hospital. I didn't know when all of this started years ago that we were going to enroll in a bunch of natural history studies and trials and genetic studies, that they were all not going to be coordinated. I thought the data would be shared. I thought the data was going to be used to understand patient journeys. You know, how does a child go from being healthy to progressing in this disease state, to a spreading of the disease, a metastasis, if you will, to the neural network, to the point where her brain is completely dysfunctional and is only continuing to become so as she grows. You know, how are we going to use that data for the next generation of Savannahs that were out there? We learned by trial and error that these studies that we were participating in and these trials were uncoordinated. And Savannah was just another specimen in these uncoordinated studies. The questions that we were asked in the studies were the same questions that were asked in every single other study. And we had to answer them yet again on the backdrop of all of this dysfunction and all of this disease and all of these issues that we were having at home. Some of the questions could be completely irrelevant anytime we were asked, compared to a typical, peer of her same age, how does she perform? Can't compare her to a peer. She's a severely intellectually disabled child and then became an adult. And some of the questions that we were asked are just borderline insensitive. They would ask things like, can she do this? Can she do that? And it was always no, no, no. And I still roll my eyes at the suicide and depression scales that are mandatory in clinical trials, because I don't know how to assess suicide in somebody who's the mental age of a 2-year-old that struggles to put on their pants. The system that was supposed to be helping us was actually hurting us. It was definitely wasting our time, but it was also spreading these misconceptions about LGS, that these kids that are severely intellectually disabled could even be functioning like their peers. And it seemed really to me along our journey that we were really learning very little about her disease, very little that would help the next generation. It was not a learning system, it was a checkbox system. And Savannah was another checkbox, and I was the box checker. I didn't really know that when we started on this journey, that when she was 18, that I would find the cause of her seizures, it's genetic, and that we would find a medicine that would work. We did. And when she was 18 years old, she had a 99% reduction in all of her episodes of emergency seizure interventions and a 95% reduction in all her seizures. And that's still going on today when she's 27 years old. We don't live at the hospital anymore. She's not getting weekly rescue treatments, and she's learning and growing again. The thing is, though, is I don't think that would have happened if I hadn't gotten my PhD and asked questions about her health. Even if Savannah was diagnosed today, I'm not sure that she would get directed to that medicine. I didn't know that in 2020 I would be standing before all of you guys, or sitting, I guess, in this case, sharing this information, telling you about our journey, but also the broken system that was trying to help us, the one that you all work in just as much as I work in now. We've all become unwitting agents of this system. We work in it. We don't necessarily like it. I don't know who it's working for. It's certainly not working for patients and families. The research is siloed. The data is siloed. We're not learning. We're not helping. And really the studies that we've participated, even recent ones, seem more like a means to an end. But to achieve what and for whom, it's hard to determine. We always say that it's in the name of patients and families, but I'm not sure that much has changed when we started our journey 25 years ago. I still meet families today that are experiencing the very similar disease journey to ours, a painful journey, and they're still participating in these studies and filling out these questions and being involved in research in ways that are just increasing the devastation, making it harder and harder for them to move forward, harder and harder for them to participate in these studies. The system is broken, and genius isn't the problem. Technology isn't the problem. It's not even really a money problem. It's an ideology problem. It's our beliefs in the way that the system works and our guiding principles and the way we've been taught, the positions that we hold, and the incentives that we have in place. These are the things that are making it more and more difficult. It seems like all of these things, these beliefs that we have, are at odds of a patient and a family having a more positive rare disease journey, or at least a less cumbersome rare disease journey. And so I'm excited to begin the conversation where we can do better, where we can think about helping the next generation of Savannahs out there so that their journey doesn't have to be as painful as ours has been, at least in the places that we can help. Rare disease is hard, it's difficult, it's not easily solved, but we, as members of this system, have a chance to change it and make it better for patients and families. And I'm eager for us to get started doing that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tracy. That was incredibly moving. Those are words to remember that we all, as members of this community, as caregivers, as researchers, as industry members, have a responsibility to find ways to do better for the patients we serve. Now I'd like to recognize Craig Lipset, today's chief provocateur, and hand over the discussion to him. Craig is a recognized leader at the forefront of innovation in clinical research and medicine development. He's the founder of the Clinic of Clinical Innovation Partners, where he works as an advisor and board member with pharma, tech, and venture capital to bring vision to the intersection of research, digital solutions, and patient engagement. Craig is also a successful innovator himself, having launched 2 successful startup companies. Previously, Craig was the head of clinical innovation and venture partner at Pfizer and was on the founding operations committee for Transcelerate Biopharma. Today, he serves on the board of directors for the Foundation for Sarcoidosis Research and the MedStar Health Research Institute, as well as on the editorial board for Therapeutic Innovation and Regulatory Science. Craig, please take it away.
Thank you, Paul. And thank you, Tracy and Savannah, as well, for hearing that story and for level setting us for the conversation we're about to have today. Just a reminder, this is session 1 of the 4-part series. Today we will be covering FDA leadership on data standards and what might be the asks that we might have of the FDA on this topic. There are 3 other sessions. That's my way of queuing up that we are hungry for your conversation in the Q&A window. Please contribute and make this a dynamic session together. But keep in mind, we're not going to be able to answer every single question on this first session. Bear in mind, we do have 3 others, and so some of the topics may end up getting deferred a little bit. I think Paul already introduced who I am, so I will jump past this and jump right in. To begin each of these in the series, we wanted to share just a few level-setting definitions for some of the terminology we'll be using. And I pulled a patient registry definition, which is largely summarized by a lot of the common language found from the EMA, FDA, and NIH websites around a registry being an organized system that uses observational methods to collect uniform data to evaluate specified outcomes for a population that's typically defined by a disease, a condition, or an exposure, and that is serving a predetermined purpose, whether scientific, clinical, or policy. This slide further goes on to share some of the different use cases, many of which will come up in our conversations today, whether that's around understanding natural history, patient recruitment opportunities, or the opportunity to monitor safety and efficacy, and so on. We'll also be talking a bit about the aspiration of a common data architecture for registries. And when we think about a data architecture, the definition I have here emphasizes the schemas, integration, transformation, storage, and workflow that's required of the data. It's about how the data is collected, integrated, enhanced, stored, and delivered. It's all things data, from the moment the data is being captured and the plans that went into designing that, through to everything that's required to serve that data up for its analytic use cases. Some of our conversation will get into this theme of regulatory grade real-world evidence. And for a definition here, and I think we'll be able to share links to all these papers on the website afterward, I used a paper that was co-authored by Amy Abernathy before her joining the FDA, where she and her co-author defined a checklist for regulatory grade real-world evidence, emphasizing 6 attributes: high quality, complete, transparent, generalizable, timely, and scalable. And then finally, some of our discussion may start to reach into the topic of information blocking. And as a definition here, I pulled from HHS, the healthit.gov website, where the emphasis on information blocking in this context around health data leans into any of these stakeholders looking to interfere with access, exchange, or use of electronic health information. We're here today and for the series of 4 sessions because registries are blooming everywhere. There are, I would say, 1,000 registries blooming, and in many cases it's because there are a lot of different ways the registries can be presented. This is a 2x2 that I usually think about as I think about the proliferation of registries today and some of the differences, because we talked about a definition that provides a common framework, but in reality, the phenotype of registries can be radically different from one to the next. I usually think about 2 questions. Who is being engaged? Is this a registry that's being built by engaging with healthcare providers? Or is it a registry that is focused on engaging patients as the engaged party to share data? And then the second attribute to me to differentiate many of these registries today is, what is the data source from which the data is being acquired? Is the data being manually entered, as has traditionally been the case for many registries, whether requiring burden on physicians or patients to manually capture data? Or is the data being electronically sourced and being pulled from electronic health records or shared electronically by the patient from wherever its original source may have been? In many cases today, this is creating this universe of registry redundancy where we'll find multiple registries within any one of those discrete populations that I described in the original definition. Within any one condition or disease area, we may find multiple registries and then struggle with the differences in completeness of data, as well as the likelihood that some patients may overlap across registries. And with a lack of data architecture that is consistent from one to the next, how can we even begin to reconcile across those? But I'll also set up here that the registries are only at the tip of the iceberg in terms of proliferation, and that as open data rules continue to democratize access to health data for patients, as we're already seeing from this year's announcement about a new API from the Department of Health and Human Services for supporting open data initiatives, the likely future here is that any community of patients will quickly be able to become data enabled and spark yet another registry, creating this challenge of what I view as a growing cacophony of registries. Now, as has been pointed out in the lead-in for this session today, we have a number of challenges across these different registries today: data silos, exclusivity in terms of access, lack of standards, inconsistent sharing. I feel that this is a quote I've kind of adapted from others. I would argue that our current system of registries is not broken. It's simply delivering the registry ecosystem based upon the existing economic incentives presented to academia, advocacy groups, and pharma. It's the Freakonomics of registries. And this creates an opportunity for this conversation for us to challenge assumptions and think about how we can disrupt the incentives. And I list here a number of examples of where the FDA and the federal government have used the power of incentives to radically alter the landscape, whether around orphan drug development, pediatric drug development, and a number of other areas. They're examples that carrots and sticks can work to achieve goals when we have gaps in the research ecosystem. So with that, I'm looking forward now to introducing you to some of our panelists. And the three key questions we'll keep coming back to during our session today will lean into what might we ask of FDA to strengthen a common data architecture, to agree upon what regulatory quality data might mean, and to help ensure that information blocking is not blocking our desired future for registries in rare disease. With that, I'm going to invite our first panelist, Anthony, to come off mute, join the camera, and please introduce yourself.
Thank you so much. It's a real honor to be here. So I'm Anthony Philippakis, and I wear three hats in life. I trained as a cardiologist at Brigham and Women's Hospital, specialty in rare genetic cardiovascular diseases. The vast majority of my time is currently at the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard, where I'm the chief data officer and lead an organization of software engineers and machine learning experts. Finally, I also spend part of my time moonlighting in industry, and I've been a venture partner at GB for 9 years now. So my group has been quite involved in the registries and rare disease space for about 5 years from now. And it goes back to an early interaction with Brad Margus, who many of you know, who's been very involved in ataxia-telangiectasia research. And one of the things that got us excited about it is the idea of empowering patients to own their own data, to govern who can use it and for what research purpose. One of the things that I find quite compelling, and it could unlock a lot of other changes, is the idea of empowering patients to donate their data to medical research. When you think about it right now, people can donate their blood, they can donate their organs, but one of the things that they really can't donate is their data. And in many ways, this is what medical research most needs. And so trying to build organizations that enable patients to donate their data to medical research, and then also empower them to retain governance over how it's used, I think is crucial to what follows. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anthony. I'm looking forward to hearing more in a few moments. Next, I'd like to invite Dr. Elizabeth Hart from FDA. Please come off mute, join the camera. Dr. Hart, I do have your slides, so if you'll just call out a next slide, I'll be happy to advance for you.
Great, thank you, and thank you for including me in the discussion today. I am the branch chief of General Medicine 1 in the Office of Tissues and Advanced Therapies, and it's the Center for Biologics Evaluation Research at the FDA. And so I'm here to provide a little bit of regulatory background and some examples about this natural history data. So I think the first thing to always remember is what is the FDA's mission, and that is that we are responsible for advancing public health by helping to speed innovations that make medical products more effective, safer, and more affordable, and by helping the public to get more accurate science-based information that they need to use the medical products and foods to maintain and improve their health. Next slide. So as far as regulatory requirements, we always think in terms of approval and what's needed. And so what we look for all drugs and biologics is that there's substantial evidence of effectiveness, and that's typically defined as data from adequate and well-controlled studies. And I think it's important to remember that there is regulatory flexibility in applying these regulatory standards, but these regulatory standards do apply to rare disease. Next slide. So what can be done. We're all here because we share an interest in finding treatments and cures for these rare diseases, and we want to work together. So I think one of the greatest challenges in rare diseases, deciding an endpoint, figuring out what are the measures for those endpoints, what are the instruments, how are the biomarkers, because often it's challenging due to the fact that the natural history is often poorly defined for many of these diseases, and that there are not predefined endpoints in the same ways as exist for many of the common diseases that already have approved therapies, and then just simply based on the nature of them being a rare disease, the data sets will often be small and limited. And so each patient is really valuable, and we need to do our best to maximize that data and the information so that we can help them. Next slide. So we have a bunch of programs to work with sponsors so that we can use that flexibility that I spoke about earlier. Next slide. So I want to talk about one example, and this is a gene therapy that was designed for SMA, spinal muscular atrophy, specifically for patients with biallelic mutations in the SMN1 gene. And this was approved in 2019. Next slide. So one of the things that makes this disease a little bit easier than some of the other rare diseases is that it's got a very clearly defined natural history with relatively decent genotype-phenotype correlation. Next slide. Oh, and the other thing I should mention is that there is rapid progression, and patients with the most severe disease tend to die by 2 years of age. So there's a quick clinical correlation. And so the primary study that was used to demonstrate efficacy looked at survival and then looked at milestones that typically in the natural history. Next slide. And this was corroborated with ongoing phase 3 data. Next slide. So that was definitely a success story where the sponsor and the agency were able to look at external control natural history. But often that's not the case. And I think it's important to remember that natural history data has many important purposes beyond being used as an external control, and probably most importantly, to be used to help plan and design studies. And in general, we still think that it's important for most studies to be controlled and randomized and beginning early. But even more important than that is the collaboration that's needed, because everything needs to be individualized. And then come talk to us early. We really want to help. And I look forward to discussing with all of you more. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that set us on a good path in terms of at least some great use cases as we think about the potential for well-thought registry data. Dr. Sid, welcome. Would you like to take yourself off mute and introduce yourself, please?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
So my name is Eric Sid, and I am with the NIH as a program officer. At the NIH, one of the newest centers we have is NCATS, or the National Center for Advancing Translational Science. Translational science is the process of turning observations from various stages of research, from preclinical to clinical, clinical to implementation into public health. So we're really focused on the issue of rare diseases. We have, in fact, an Office of Rare Diseases Research, because really the problem for many rare diseases is the approach of trying to find these platform solutions that can really move rare diseases research across from different stages of research, and looking at this as a scalable problem across all 7,000 plus rare diseases. So I work in a number of different I work on a number of different programs we have. Mostly, I like to think of us as acting as a nexus for really connecting patients, patient advocacy groups, researchers, clinicians, industry together. So we have several programs that run the gambit of trying to provide patients and caregivers with health literate information, patient advocacy groups with understanding research and education and training, as well as trying to support researchers with various, again, platform approaches, whether it be with gene therapies or with data. I wanted to focus really on a couple aspects of this. Again, I love how Craig described this cacophony of registries, and that really the situation we're facing with this federalizing of the number of registries that are going to be out there and data is really a wild west in many ways. And some of the threats that we have to try to overcome are just the creation of new silos. One thing we oftentimes hear from patient advocacy groups is we need to have a registry. We need to be able to do something now. Much of our work is really focused on this issue of not just educating about registries, but really about educating on data literacy. So this urgency and dedication to do something is amazing, but at the same time, often folks run into the problem of just collecting what we like to refer to as stuff. Oftentimes, in the past, for example, ORDR, Office of Rare Diseases Research, actually launched in 2010 a previous program called the Global Rare Diseases Data Registry Repository, otherwise known as GRDR. At the time, what this tried to do is create a number of different solutions, such as common data elements, a global unique identifier to help connect patients across different studies. But the challenge that we stumbled upon was that this was really an unscalable approach. Our efforts were focused on data cleaning, for which basically the resources and costs were unsustainable for scaling up to 7,000. One of the things we noted was just that we were arriving at the discussion too late. More recently, in the last couple of years, we switched to more of an educational and resource repository model and developed another website called Rare Disease Registry or RADAR program that really just focuses much more on the user experience for patient groups and trying to bring these conversations about data literacy and registries much earlier into their journey. We also work a lot with really assisting and advising different patient advocacy groups on the need for this data stewardship. So beyond data literacy, it's really a question of how they need to govern these repositories and registries. So the question really comes back for what is the purpose of a registry and what is the requirement for a patient advocacy group? Oftentimes, the discussion isn't about issues such as HIPAA compliance, but really about trust and sustainability. There's a number of different competitions and incentives amongst researchers, academicians, industry groups, but even within patient advocacy groups. For example, oftentimes patient communities themselves are not a monolith. They're not always united. There are factions and there are perhaps fractures. Part of what we need to do in terms of discussing some of the issues there is really talking about the issues and power of data and how we can try to leverage that. So empowerment means making sure that, for example, we do not further disparities. One of the concepts that we try to discuss on our RADAR website, for example, is about the issue of collecting data on demographics. This is an important issue, especially right now, in that if we don't collect this data, we may inadvertently further some of these disparities that already exist among some populations. So much of the efforts that we are trying to do at NCATS and NIH as a whole are really work with many of the other groups that are out there developing things, whether that be RareX, whether that be the FDA NORD's Rare Disease Accelerator, RDCA, I believe, and the data analytics platform. But really, our role as, again, as NIH resource is really coming in the middle of this and trying to support all the different players there by really focusing on what is it required to really drive research forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sid. I love your phrase that about how it is for well-intentioned advocacy groups to just want to go out and collect stuff because the tools are so easy to do so. But thinking about data literacy and data stewardship is such an important priority. I'm looking forward to the conversation. Our final panelist today, Dr. Susan Thornton-Jones, please come off mute, activate your camera, and I'll be happy to advance your slides.
Okay, thank you. So I'm Suzanne Thornton-Jones. I lead the Regulatory Affairs and Compliance Group at the University of Pennsylvania Gene Therapy Program. I've been working in global reg affairs for 15 years plus, and I also used to be a reviewer at FDA. What I bring to this table is the regulatory affairs aspect by helping to facilitate the use of natural history study data for support of clinical trials and eventually registration. And over the last 2 years, we've had quite a number of interactions with both the FDA, EMA, and MHRA regarding the use of this natural history data as a comparator arm. We've also approached it both from a pediatric as well as an adult rare disease from an indication perspective. Next slide, please. So today I want to present 2 case studies where we actually went to health authorities. One was where there was no natural history data that existed, so therefore we needed to conduct a natural history study to better understand the disease progression as well as to act as that comparator arm. We were very clear in the documents that how would we conduct the study, be under protocol. It would start ahead of the first in human. It was not a screening study, but it was just supportive because there was very little known about the disease progression. We provided in great detail how we would use the data, how we would select the data, and that it would mirror the patients from a demographic, disease state, and treatment status to be able to achieve what we thought was the regulatory quality of the data to use as that comparator arm. The second case that we took to health authorities is where there was already existing natural history data, more than one source. Of course, when that happens, you have to ask the holders of the data, can you use it and how you're going to use it. So for the regulators, we detailed in quite explicit manner of how we were going to conduct a retrospective analysis on a prospectively collected data set. We were going to do the analysis under a formal clinical protocol. We also, again, were very clear on how we were going to use the data was going to mirror everything that we are proposing for approval. And if there were gaps in any one data set from any one source, we would address it by filling with other sources or other existing natural history data. Next slide, please. So in short, what came back is, as everything, health authorities, right? And I've been on both sides of the table. I've worked at the FDA, I've been in pharma, is that it's always about data-driven decisions. The feedback that we received from across the pond, either EMA, MHRA, as well as FDA, is the feedback was basically, show me the data. Probably doesn't meet the regulatory quality for acceptability, but show it to us anyway. Oh, and by the way, go ahead and conduct a double-blind randomized placebo-controlled study, which was crazy because we're talking a rare, ultra-rare disease without any approved treatment. And by the way, the natural history data you have is nice to understand the disease, but the shortcomings really are not going to allow you to use it to support registration. So thank you, and looking forward to the discussion on this.
We clearly have a phenomenal panel for this conversation. I'd like to make sure the folks that are listening know that they're invited to participate. Join the Q&A. Share your thoughts, questions, reactions as we're proceeding in this conversation. And Anthony, I'd like to turn back to you for this first question, if you don't mind. We're thinking first about this topic of what might be our asks for the FDA. And the first question leans in around data architecture, which I sense is near and dear to your heart. Clearly, there's a great opportunity if we were to harmonize and reconcile around new registries going live using a common data architecture. Do you have initial thoughts on what might the FDA be able to do that can help drive that future with different academic groups, with different advocacy groups, as well as with the private sector?
Yeah, a few thoughts on this. So the first one is, the need for adhering to relatively straightforward data models that are widely in use. When you think about the world of clinical trials, the creation of CDISC as a data standard was a wonderful, development. Of course, it creates a lot of work for different groups to be able to take the data that's collected from their clinical trials and map it into CDISC. But there are upsides to that too. We now see a lot of tools that facilitate that, and there's a vibrant ecosystem of software solutions. As we start to think about the world of registries, I think that it's very important that we see a similar set of data standards evolve that will create a win-win for everyone. But then another important part is being able to ensure that there are ways that the data can be portable once it's been collected. I'd hate to see business models evolve where groups try to create silos of data and then leverage that for economic benefit. As I said, I spend part of my time in the for-profit world. I have no problem with business models in general, but I think in this domain of rare diseases, just the moral imperative is too high. And so ensuring that we have something that looks much more like the SWIFT system in financial exchange, which banks use to be able to wire and exchange money to each other, rather than our current state of electronic medical records in the US, is crucial.
And when you think about that rise in opportunity of data standards, how do you drive adoption? How do you make it so much easier for people to use a data standard that there's no reason for them to use any other data architecture or data model?
Yeah, I think in the beginning, unfortunately, it probably has to be a bit more stick than carrot. And of course, you don't like that. But just the simple fact of FDA saying that this is part of your submission, or adherence to this data model is part of your submission package, will drive a lot of change. And what it will do is then you'll start to see the rise of different tooling to make that easy, much as it happened with CDISC. I don't know the history of how CDISC became adopted, but I suspect it was not because it was so clear that it was so much better and easier to use than everything else out there. It was actually probably, in fact, the worst alternative except for everything else. Again, others may tell me I'm wrong on that. But then once that was selected, we do see a lot happen downstream to make it easier for everyone.
Elizabeth, as you hear some of those thoughts about CDISC as a great example on the clinical data side, I think it was through maybe a few more sticks than carrots to get early adoption at an enterprise level. Is that a potential pathway? Is that one of the asks we should consider with the FDA to require, as of a certain date, that all registry data that is used to support any regulatory interaction conforms to a certain predefined data standard? Oh, sorry, Elizabeth, we've got you on mute still.
Sorry.
That's a phrase of 2020, I'm told, by the way.
Exactly. I'm really not in a position to predict what's coming from a policy perspective. I can talk about some of the experiences that we have currently. And right now we are very much on we will suggest and meet. We're obviously meeting with sponsors, but we're also meeting a lot and speaking with the individual patient groups because it's very clear this can't be done alone. But when it comes to individual submissions, we are reviewing the individual submissions.
Very fair. Very fair. I would imagine, Eric, that a lot of this also leans into what's near and dear to you, as you've been focusing so much around data literacy and helping to bring advocacy groups along. When you're engaging with advocacy groups today and you're trying to help point them to resources to bring education and awareness, are folks receptive to using common data architectures, or is it still just a confusing area of too much white space?
Yeah, part of the difficulty is the ease of finding these data standards and then deciding them Much of the issues that we try to address with some of the reality of the situation from many patient registries is oftentimes, if you look at the volume of questions they're trying to ask and the sheer amount of survey fatigue they're requiring with their participants, sometimes it's really looking at what is the not just the most valid tool, but really what is the purpose of your registry. Oftentimes, many of the groups, again, are trying to do everything that they can. And I think that's kind of one of the key issues here is that they can draw upon some of the lessons from some of the other patient groups as well as some of the other studies that have occurred in their space. But oftentimes they're looking for, the best fit in their situation when there is no real comparator. So in many cases, what we're trying to do is just try to figure out where does this align the most in terms of their research questions, in terms of other groups that may have data that is similar in scope and in quality, and then trying to decide, how to choose which of these. So again, part of the problem is it's being at a buffet table, but only having one plate, and trying to decide what you do. Are you going into in-depth? Are you going into broadness? How do you kind of decide that? And for many of the patient groups that are trying to make these decisions, again, they're in a space where they have multiple competing demands from both industry as well as researchers wanting to leverage their registry. So much of this for them is really kind of deciding, what's just a path to take forward. They're looking for any standard that they can really choose, and in some ways, building off of that, it's really just about having good data in the end. As long as you have some type of standard that you can choose that is really usable, that's kind of the question for me. But really, oftentimes, again, the problem is there's so many conceptual questions at that stage for them.
And a reminder to the audience, please keep your questions coming in the Q&A section, as well as not just questions. If you have other observations or builds on anything that you're hearing, please feel free to contribute it through that Q&A box. I see many of you have found your way to the Q&A window. Thank you. Suzanne, just building on Eric's point, is this a challenge of lack of education among different stakeholders around the availability of common data architectures, or do they just not exist? Do we have to start back at step one and do what CDISC did for the registry space so that then we can begin a more centralized, discrete education campaign together?
Right. So, the statement is you don't know what you don't know. So when you're going after registries or natural histories that already exist, the hoops you have to jump through to even know if the data is usable is step one. So, I'm quite sure it hasn't been collected per CDISC or anything else, but to clean it up is probably going to take more work. So I would propose that we need to start from where we are now and make sure that the data that's being collected can be used. And if CDISC is the way to go, great, but I'm not sure that is the way to go. Not everyone's going to be able to convert their data to that type of format. So, I think we need to think outside the box. There are a lot of online AI forums now or other ways to capture the data. And I think that this is not going to be putting the peg in a round hole. It's creating a new way. It's creating a new box. And I think we can learn, but I don't think it's going to fit every situation or this situation, in all honesty.
Is AI going to just solve our problems, Suzanne? Can we
I don't know.
Data architecture be darned? We're just going to let the bots figure it out for us after the fact?
I don't know. I'm always worried about Terminator, right? But no, so I don't think so. But I think that we can take some of the lessons we're learning with AI to help predict in the future where we need to be from a data perspective. So I'm talking totally out of my head. I have no experience with AI other than watching all the Terminator movies. But I'm sure there is something we can learn both from the past and where we're going in the future. And I don't think that CDISC is the ultimate answer. Maybe it's part of it, but I don't know if it's all of it.
Anthony, something tells me you know your way around AI pretty well. Is there an AI-driven solution or aid here, or do we really just have to start nuts and bolts like CDISC did and start saying, what's the data architecture that we can all agree on to advocate centrally?
Yeah, So let me start by saying I don't know that there's a cure-all. There are at least two approaches that might be viable to try and accelerate progress. The first is there are a lot of tools that exist that are kind of machine learning for data wrangling. And so for trying to get data sets into various standards, and make that still a human involved process, but much faster and easier than otherwise. One of the ones that I'm quite familiar with in the Boston area is a company called Tamer. In full disclosure, it's a GB company. There are others, but I've seen a lot of groups use them and other tools to try and facilitate the data wrangling steps. Another idea, and this is a little bit more highfalutin and not ready for prime time, but I think it would be a very interesting pilot to try. In the world of machine learning, a lot of what people will do is take a raw data set and map it into what's called a latent space, which is kind of an abstracted high-dimensional form of it. So concretely, when you think about how things like translation algorithms work to translate from one to another, they always have an intermediate layer where you go from English into this abstracted latent space and then into Japanese or then into German, etc. If you start thinking about this wealth of different large dimensional human data sets that exist, starting to build out some kind of abstracted layer that really is not so easily interpretable by a human, but then would allow you to move between data models and translate between them. I think this is worth pilot efforts as a research activity, because if it were to work, it could end up being very valuable downstream.
Thank you, Anthony. Elizabeth, we're so focused on what should we be asking of FDA, but let me flip that question around for you. What would you want to ask of advocacy groups, industry, or others that in academia that are creating registries today? And this can be I'm not representing the FDA in my response, Craig, reply.
Okay, thank you for that. So I would say, again, speaking personally, what I think is important is what is the data being used for? And so one thing that we always think about in science is garbage in, garbage out. And so really getting into how high quality is that data. So one thing that we tend to think about a lot that's easy to capture is mortality. Okay, that's clear. Somebody is either alive or dead. That's very binary. But then you start looking at how other practices have changed, and you look at the use of other supportive therapies. You look at the use of ventilators. You look at the use of feeding assistance and decisions that individual parents, individual patients are making, and how that can impact outcomes. And so no longer maybe is that mortality endpoint always so absolute. That's why you'll often see in some of the labels, ventilator-free survival. But it really gets into what are you capturing and how have things changed over time. When you look at endpoints that are a little bit less clear, which is often the case with rare diseases, you've got something that has a major impact, but maybe doesn't cause rapid mortality. You want to think about what is going to be interpretable. Again, going towards what are the regulatory requirements. You look in terms of, is this going to provide information on how patients feel, function, or survive? And that feel and functions can be very difficult. And so starting early to find out what is important to patients and how do you measure that? Because oftentimes there might not be a good tool. And a tool can't always be repurposed from one condition to another, from one population to another. The example of the depression index in a woman who has the mental capacity of a 2-year-old, gets into, you have to be smart in what you're choosing. And that applies both to experimental therapies, but it also gets into natural history data when you look into the granularity of what's being collected.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Eric, I have to admit, I worked with the NIH around the GRDR and a certain one of the nonprofits involved, but I've lost track of radar. And there are a lot of questions coming from the audience that I keep wondering in my mind, is that in the scope for radar? Should it be in the scope for radar? Some of these are questions around data literacy, helping to make sure we have just a common lexicon. Others are questions around, is there a database of databases, a registry of registries? What's in scope for radar today? What's in scope for radar tomorrow that could start to create a hub around this topic?
Yeah, and let me start again, kind of identifying some of the problems with GRDR and why we kind of switched our approach. So really, the problem that GRDR faced was this issue of both, on the one hand, scalability, as well as on the other hand, we were trying to develop data standards. So we developed, common data elements around rare diseases. But then everyone else also started creating their own CDEs. And you enter in, again, this kind of issue of, well, how common are these data elements if everyone's going to generate their own version of a common data element, correct? So part of the problem that we're trying to address in some ways is just trying to move the conversation a little bit more upstream. We started with conceptualization of kind of focusing on the contact registry. We still want to move into further along down towards a natural history study. But really, in some ways, what we're trying to do is understand what is it that we need to do to bring forward resources that are actually going to be usable by patient advocacy groups. And again, it's that carrot and the stick model. I don't really have much of a stick I can use. The best carrot I have is making an attractive, easy to understand website for patient groups to start being able to utilize. In some ways, this also kind of ties into a lot of the other efforts many of our partners and collaborators are working on, such as RareX or, again, the RDCA. I always forget the last acronyms, DCA. But I think one thing I wanted to kind of point back to is also kind of some of the remarks that Anthony was making around, thinking about data sets and machine learning tools. Some of the issues right now is really there's a lot of available terminologies for, medical terminologies, for, there are loin codes for laboratory tests. How do we start bridging some of these conversations earlier again in a way that's actually actionable for patient advocacy groups? Do they need to be informatics experts, or can we really create for them, resources that are going to be a little bit more easy to kind of manage? So in some ways, that's what we're trying to do at NCATS, not necessarily within the RADAR program, but I kind of look at it as a whole, is how do we develop better resources that patient groups can kind of grab onto and maybe connect into this data without having to know all the background. So we're trying to look at some of the issues of, addressing some of the semantics behind terminologies and this latent space that Anthony was kind of describing. You don't need to be an informatics specialist if you can just get, handed a toolkit essentially of, here are the resources, here are kind of the concepts that you need to use whenever you're reporting about your disease. As an example, many of the issues around what kind of nomenclature, for example, you use for your disease, how you describe it, how exactly does it map to any type of current terminology. We all know that ICD codes aren't the perfect representation of things. So where do you map your rare disease to make sure that it is, in the future, your data is going to be sustainable?
Thank you, Eric. Suzanne, we're so much of these sessions leans into wanting to make sure that our data across registries can be used for its highest purposes. And for many, the highest purpose is toward regulatory decision making. Is there such a thing that should we be defining regulatory grade registry data? Are we able to label a definition and ultimately be able to say this registry will be producing data that is prospectively based on its architecture, we will have confidence is regulatory grade?
Good question. So let's even take a step further back, terminology wise. Some people, even in this session, we say registry. I'm saying natural history studies. They're different, right? The objectives are different. So I think that we even need to figure out, can we use the same terminology or data collection for a registry versus a natural history study, because they are very different in the objectives. And to Dr. Hart's point, it all depends on what's your end result, right? You always start with the end in mind. So what's the objective for use of the data? And maybe the objective is going to help us define what that data set, that regulatory criteria, that regulatory requirement to meet it needs to be. I think I just lost my train of thought. But anyway,
well, actually, you raise a good question. This came up in our audience Q&A as well. Can you give a simple distinction between registry and natural history studies for our audience and for all of us?
So I'd like to ask that to the panelists, because to me, I'm not sure they're that different if the objective is to use the data for regulatory approval. So I'm also coming at it from a very different perspective. So I would ask the panelist or anyone in the audience, is there a true distinctive difference? Again, for me, I'm coming from, I want to use this data for registrational purposes. So I don't really care whether it's called a registration or a natural history study. I'm going to be using it for the same objective.
Panelists?
Hey, this is Eric. I'll add that, registries are just a fancy way of talking about databases, really, right? So in many ways, I would agree that the two are not necessarily simultaneous. You can have a natural history registry, which is, again, a database built for holding natural history data. Your registry can have some natural history data, but also be modular in that you can also ask questions about other types of studies. So oftentimes, many groups develop a core kind of registry that then perhaps covers many of these questions that you would want on a natural history study, but allows you to also use that framework to ask other questions. So you can add on a wing, essentially, to that with questions about quality of life, for example, or questions about, you name it. Essentially, researchers can kind of tag into this registry by adding additional data as they go.
Elizabeth, as we think about this thread around regulatory grade data, are we better off starting with specific use cases or even starting with specific registries that we can point to and say, just as you were doing earlier in your case study, should we be building up a library of specific use cases that have been successful and the registries that enable them? And is that our starting place to be able to define regulatory grade?
So again, I think it gets down to what is the purpose. But if you're saying that the purpose is to use it as an external control, which I would say is definitely a possibility, but is not always the purpose, nor should it be the purpose. Because sometimes we often see where that leads the drug or biologic development program to be longer than it would have been, and you could have gotten an answer much faster if you'd started off with a randomized controlled study from the beginning. But if you're saying that for the purposes of discussion, you're looking at a external control group, then I think that the ICH E10 guidance provides a lot of useful advice as far as the importance between the populations, as far as the comparability of the assessments, the timing of the assessments, but in the end, to get over the fact that you don't have randomization, what you need is a huge treatment effect.
So if we were to think, Elizabeth, about, if everybody had a vote on what would be our highest priority use case for air quotes regulatory grade registry data, would your vote be around control arms and control data use?
So again, I think it depends upon the purpose. I think that there is a lot that no two rare diseases are the same, no two drug development programs are the same. So there's not one answer. And I think if you talk to different patient populations, their priorities are also very different. And I think it's really important that everybody's voice is heard. But I do think that there are a lot of similarities and commonalities with rare disease. And as I mentioned before, one of them has to do with the challenge of figuring out endpoints. And so sometimes having that natural history data can help in the planning of a controlled study, such as what are your endpoints going to be? What is the duration that the study needs to be? What is the population that you want to target? What are predictors that can help you to identify that population? So I think that there's a lot of value to natural history studies outside of just an external control. But obviously, an external control can sometimes be helpful when you have a situation where you can't do a concurrent controlled study.
Anthony, do you feel that for us to come away with some understanding of being able to call something regulatory grade, that we have to start with prioritizing some specific use cases, that it's just too vague and ambiguous to say a registry is regulatory grade without it being aligned for a specific purpose?
Yes, I definitely agree that we need to have some driving use cases for this. And I think that there are a few very good ones that come to mind right away. One organization that I've spent quite a bit of time with over the last few years is the RareX organization that's focused on building registries for rare diseases, but with a real eye towards enabling downstream clinical research efforts by drug development companies, as well as patient foundations, et cetera. And I think efforts like that are ones that are very good initial driving use cases. Almost every rare disease group needs to create a registry in order to facilitate downstream clinical trials and have a list of who are the patients that might benefit from it. That's a particularly easy one to go after first, but there are others.
Suzanne, Eric, do you have top use cases for registries that you think should be prioritized as we think about perhaps being able to focus on what might be an example of regulatory grade? Eric, do you want to take that first?
Yeah. So I'm trying to think of. I'm struggling with specific examples. There's always a large number of them you can kind of draw to from literature. For example, the Rare Disease Clinical Research Network, or the RDCRN, has a number of different groups that have in the past created their own natural history study data. You can look to those as well as many other successful, longer, kind of historic groups such as the CF Foundation to see kind of examples of how they've gone about in this approach. Part of the question is really, going back to Elizabeth's point about this is really about the research question you have in mind. Are you trying to create a comparator, a historic comparator? Do you have both the population size of participants to be able to do that? Is the research in your disease even at the point where you're able to really start to understand some of these concepts? So much of it kind of comes back to really understanding both this current state of science in your disease, as well as trying to get a sense of just the resources and capacity of either the organizations involved or, again, the registry itself in terms of have the right space and scope to be able to do this type of work.
Thank you, Eric. Dan?
I have nothing more to add. I think it's all where we need to go. My only concern is that there's a lot of valuable data that's been collected to date. And so while we're looking at the here and now and where we're going, we need to somehow figure out how to be able to utilize this very valuable data that's already been collected. And that, to me, is the bigger hurdle. I think we can set a standard now of where we want to go, but it's the how to bring those that have been, all that data that's been collected to now to be able to use it. And if it's nothing more than just informing of the disease or the real registry, right? Just collecting data, that's great, but it'd be really great to figure out how to use that data and bring it into a regulatory approval situation, if you will.
Thank you. And Anthony, the last question that we were going to focus on, at least as far as the agenda, leans on this spirit of information blocking. And one note that I know you had called out in your opening was around that spirit of patients owning and controlling their own data. certainly that will be an amazing catalyst for powering registries going forward. And to me is all the more reason why it's important for us to have some better definitions around data architecture together. Do you, as with all the three hats that you wear, when it comes to patients being able to access and control, or is this now a fait accompli with a new API announced? Do we get to move on to another challenge?
Yeah. So actually, you broke up just a little bit. You start to say with all three hats that you wear, and then for some reason you clit out for like a second or two. So I missed the. Can you just repeat the question?
Oh, I'm sorry. So with your all three hats that you're wearing, is information blocking in terms of access for patients to their own data to be able to share to power registries? Is information blocking still an issue today, or have open data rules started to make this a non-issue going forward?
No, unfortunately, I think it's still very much an issue. And, I think it's important to break this down into at least three different axes. There's policies, there's technologies, and then there's cultural change. And I think it's certainly the case that policies are leaning, and we're starting to see the beginnings of, real teeth to the idea that patients should be able to get copies of their medical data in a standardized format and then do with it what they will. But the reduction to practice of that by medical centers is not yet there, and I think it needs to be. And then importantly, there's also the social movement of really getting patients excited about the idea that they can donate their data to medical research, and the creation of trusted groups in either the commercial or nonprofit sector that are there to help them as receptors of where they can send their data to make sure that it gets used by researchers. And finally, what I'll say too is that even on the policy side, we're getting good legislation that allows data to be taken out of medical systems. But then there's actually creation of the governance mechanisms that allows the patients to control who can use their data and for what research purpose. This is something that I spend a lot of my day at the Broad Institute as the Chief Data Officer worrying about, because as a group, we really believe in data sharing and want to see it happen. But creating the technologies that make that easy to govern what are appropriate uses of data, right now it's still a very human-centric situation. So I think on all three fronts, policy, technology, and culture, we still have a lot of work to do. And again, I do want to point to my colleagues at the RareX organization. Nicole Boyce, many of you might know, has really been a champion of this for quite a while. And I think what they're doing is really work that I admire.
Thanks so much, Anthony. Suzanne, what are your thoughts on information blocking and patient data access right now? Do you feel like we're directionally correct, or is this still an area we need to double down on in order to catalyze these registries going forward?
Yeah, I think we need to double down. The data access, even just to look to see if the data is even going to be able to work for your situation is very long, drawn out. You have to write a letter, you have to provide a protocol, you have to be very clear on how you're going to use the data, but sometimes you don't exactly know what data you have to know if it's going to be usable or not. So yeah, I think double down and let's break the silos, right? That's a common motto, is break down the silos. And there are a lot of silos, and perhaps the way to do that is to incentivize. What incentives could we provide both for those that are collecting the data and those that want to use it?
If a patient's data has value, can they participate in the monetization of that data that may flow downstream?
That's a good question. I don't know, I see Eric shaking his head up and down. I'm kind of 50-50 on that. Eric, what do you think?
Or do you just agree that that's a question worth asking?
I agree that's a question worth asking, definitely.
Anthony, I think you had a comment on that one?
Yeah, on this one, I like the principle of letting the patients benefit from it, but I actually worry that it's kind of misguided. And let me explain is, The reality is that the value of any one patient's data or just one patient isn't very great. And so the amount that you would actually send to a person for using their data, it would probably be a very small amount of money. And I worry that by kind of leaning into this, we turn what is a very high-minded aspirational goal of donating data into something very transactional and icky, and that won't actually even bring much money to the patients and could really undermine the goal of data sharing. So for me, at least, like I said, no problem with the spirit of letting patients benefit monetarily, but I really believe that actually I would much rather see the conversation at the donation level rather than the transactional level.
It'll be interesting to see over time our learnings around what motivates the masses. And do we need different types of incentives for different stakeholders to be able to engage and participate? I know that on our agenda, we're now out of time, but I'd like to just take 5 more minutes with the panel and cover some of the questions that have popped up in the Q&A that are related to the topic, but weren't necessarily spot on. And I will call out, again, for all of our attendees, 3 more webinars coming up this month. Some of the topics around what about outside the US and harmonizing across the globe, that's a topic for an entire webinar coming up in just a few weeks. One of the questions, Eric, that I had seen pop up in the thread that made me think about some of your work is, how do we make sure that when we're defining a common data architecture at the top, we're not compromising in terms of the variety and fidelity of data that we may be able to aspire to capture at the bottom? How do we not prevent registries from capturing the breadth of potential data that may make the most sense for them if they feel constrained by a common model at the top?
Yeah, again, it's a tough one because it goes into a lot of the problems around common data elements as a whole. How do you categorize yourself, especially, knowing that the field of rare diseases includes such diversity and breadth of types of diseases, etiology, pathophysiology, and just even, being able to kind of say what would be a core data set. We know that there are some things you should be doing in terms of, some data standards that we have to adhere to. The question, once you kind of delve into some of the research questions of it, and especially when thinking about a natural history study, I think part of this is even being able to comb through and say what are best practices in natural history studies as a whole, and defining, I think, this question of what is regulatory grade data really, it really serves well in terms of, thinking about the purpose of a registry. It shouldn't just be to collect any types of data. If we are trying to promote something, and if we really want to focus on natural history data, I think we need to make sure that that's chief amongst our thoughts before we start saying how do we corral all this together. Again, it's a little bit of a meandering answer because it's a very tough concept to, I think, wrap your head around.
Elizabeth, some of our audience were really taken by your case study that you shared at the outset, and we're left wondering, how many more examples are there like these of where the FDA was able to take advantage of a control arm that was sourced from another data set? Are there published lists? Are there other resources that people can find from the FDA that help point out to some of these examples?
So every product that's approved, we publish the label, but we also publish the approvals and what that decision was based upon.
So it might be a good grad student project to scrape through some of those and compile some. Yeah, very interesting. Thank you. Suzanne, one last question from the audience for you. Are there some best practices that come to your mind in terms of patient groups and academics being able to work together to help them to understand data architectures and best practices around how they handle their data?
Yeah, interesting. Nothing comes to mind, although I will put a pitch in for the Orphan Disease Center at University of Pennsylvania, who does just that, brings together the patients and the foundations and try to get at how can we help you collect data, how to improve the standards, and connect you with the right people. So I'll put the plug in for ODC for that. But I'd also just want to make make one last statement, is that while we're focusing with Dr. Hart here on the FDA, and while I've worked there and know the struggles that you face in trying to approve drugs, is that this goes beyond the FDA. Right? Every rare disease is not just based in the US, it's based around the world. And so the standards that we set, CDISC or otherwise, really need to, think about, are they going to be accepted outside of the states? Because this is a one-shot deal, right? You have ultra-rare, rare diseases, and you want to utilize all the data to the best of your ability. So just to think that, again, CDISC is one particular standard, but that's not going to be accepted in Europe, for example. It's different. So we need to think even broader than what we're thinking now. So that's my pitch.
Suzanne, you don't have to pitch the Orphan Disease Center at Penn. You guys convened us here together with Amicus. Thank you for demonstrating that. Anthony, final question here from the audience leans into transparency with patients. I know I can log into my credit report. I can see everybody that's touched my credit report, and then I can lock it down if I don't want anyone to touch it. Should patients expect the same when they're interacting with registries in terms of transparency for how their registry contribution has been used?
I mean, patients should expect that. I don't think it's the reality of the world that we live in today. Now, one of the things that I will say is a little bit complicated is the standards of quality that we need to have in place if we're also going to return data back to patients and allow them to see it. So let me give a concrete example that shows up a lot in my world. Think about genome sequencing. It's not uncommon that patients in a registry, the genome sequencing would be part of the registry. And that genome sequencing may not be done in a CLIA environment. And so even if we all agree with the principle of returning data to the patients themselves, if the data isn't done in a CLIA environment, that may not be appropriate. So I think getting to a bit more clarity on what we deem to be suitably high quality data, to return it to the patients, knowing that they might use that information about their own health in different ways, I think is quite important. That being said, the spirit of transparency and the idea that any data that's collected as part of a registry should be something that the patient can themselves access, I think is key. Moreover, I think it's also key that that patient be able to see all of the people who have touched their data and what their purpose for doing so was.
Fabulous. Anthony, I think that is an excellent last word on this topic for webinar number 1. I will look forward to so much more discussion coming up next week and throughout this month with this series. Thank you to the organizers at both Penn Medicine and Amicus for bringing us together. Anthony, Elizabeth, Eric, Suzanne, thank you so much for sharing with us today. And Tracy, if you're still out there, for sharing with us to get things going. Some of you who are online right now will have a separate link to join a follow-on debriefing session. But for the rest, I will look forward to seeing you again next week, same time, fresh link. Thank you again, everyone.